Sunday night usually feels like a pause before everything begins again. But tonight, I sit longer than usual, looking at our spending notes without really moving. Something feels slightly off, though I can't name it yet. I go through this week's spending one line at a time, slower than usual. The numbers don't feel extreme, but they quietly add up. By the end, the total doesn't match what I expected. I try to recall what we actually bought this week. Nothing stands out as unnecessary or excessive, and somehow that makes it harder to understand where the money went. How can we go over budget when every choice feels small at the time? I sit there replaying moments that didn't seem important. The question lingers longer than I expect. I close the notebook and glance at the kitchen after dinner. Everything looks the same as any other day. But I know now something in our habits hasn't really changed. My name is Clara, and lately I've been trying to run this home with more awareness. It's not just about keeping things clean or meals ready anymore. I'm starting to notice how easily money slips through small, unnoticed gaps. Mornings usually begin in a steady rhythm I rarely question. I prepare breakfast while Mira waits patiently at the table. These small routines feel simple, almost automatic. After Armand leaves, the house slowly returns to quiet. I move from one task to another without much thought. The work is constant, but it feels familiar. When I notice the detergent running low, I reach for my phone. The plan is simple and clear in my mind. Just one item, then I'm done. But then more options appear on the screen. Discounts, suggestions, things that seem useful in the moment. The clarity I had starts to blur quietly. I add a few things that feel reasonable. Extra tissues, snacks for Mira, something small for the house. Each choice feels harmless on its own. None of it feels expensive when I look at it separately. It's all still within what I can afford. There's no sense of crossing a line. Maybe that's how it happens without being noticed. Small decisions that never feel like mistakes. Until the total quietly says otherwise. By midday, I felt too tired to start cooking from scratch. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, just looking at what needed to be done. Opening a food app felt like the simplest way forward. I told myself it was just for today. It had been a long day and I needed something easier. The thought felt reasonable in that moment. Later, I checked the order history without thinking much. It wasn't just once like I had assumed. It had already happened 3 times this week. I opened my budget notes again that night. This time I looked more carefully. The pattern began to form without needing much effort. It wasn't about big spending. Nothing felt excessive on its own. But the small choices kept slipping through unnoticed. I felt a quiet frustration with myself. I had believed we were doing better, but maybe we weren't as consistent as I thought. Armand sat beside me quietly. He suggested we might need to adjust the budget. I listened, but something about it didn't sit right. If the limit keeps moving, it doesn't really solve anything. It only makes the habit feel acceptable. And I realized that was the part I needed to face. I walked into the store with a list I had carefully written the night before. It felt organized, almost reassuring. I wanted to prove I could stay within it this time. At first, everything felt steady. I picked only what I needed, nothing more. It felt like I was finally in control. Then I turned into the promotion aisle without thinking much. Bright labels quietly pulled my attention. I paused longer than I expected. My hands began picking up small things without much thought. Each item felt harmless on its own. I told myself they would be useful later. That word, later, felt familiar. I noticed how easily I used it. It quietly made everything feel reasonable. At the cashier, I saw the total and paused. It wasn't extreme, but it wasn't what I planned. Something felt slightly off. It wasn't really about the number. I already understood how it happened. The pattern felt familiar in a quiet way. There wasn't one big decision that caused it. Just many small ones I didn't stop. And somehow, that was enough. Myra reached for my hand, asking for her favorite biscuit with a soft smile. I almost said yes without thinking. It felt automatic, like a habit I didn't question anymore. It wasn't about the price of the biscuit. I noticed how often I said yes after a long day, as if buying something could fill the space I missed. I looked at Mira more carefully this time. Her expression was calm, not desperate. That's when I realized she wasn't really asking for much. What she wanted felt simpler than I expected. just a moment together. Something small, but fully present. We made toast together in the kitchen instead. The jam got messy on her hands, and she laughed freely. That moment felt more than enough. Standing there, I felt something shift quietly. I often buy comfort without noticing it, even when comfort isn't what we truly need. Sometimes I buy because I'm tired, sometimes because I feel I deserve it, and sometimes just to avoid feeling like I lack something. All of those reasons feel human and familiar, but when they repeat, they slowly shape something else. And I'm just starting to see it clearly. The house feels unusually quiet tonight. Everyone is asleep, and the day has finally stopped moving. I sit alone at the kitchen table, letting the silence settle. I go through the week's spending slowly. The numbers don't surprise me anymore. It's the pattern behind them that starts to feel familiar. It always happens the same way. A quick choice made without much pause. And just as quickly, it fades from my attention. Maybe the problem isn't what I buy. Maybe it's how quickly I decide when I'm tired. There's no space between feeling and action. I know what matters to this family. But when I'm exhausted, everything starts to feel equally urgent. And that's where it becomes risky. I write down a small sentence. It feels simple, but it holds weight. A quiet reminder for moments like this. Then I add 3 questions beneath it. Not rules, just gentle pauses. Something to slow me down before I say yes. I sit back and look at it quietly. The numbers were never the real issue. It's the habits behind them that shape everything. The next morning, I decided to try something different. Not a big change, just a small rule for myself. Every unplanned purchase would have to wait for 2 minutes. I called it the pause rule. It felt simple, almost too simple at first. But something about it made me feel more aware. I gave myself 3 quiet questions. Do I really need this today? Was this part of the plan? What actually happens if I don't buy it? Later that day, I almost bought a small kitchen rack. It looked neat and useful, and the discount made it feel like the right time. Then I paused. 2 minutes felt longer than I expected, but in that space, my thoughts began to settle. The answer became clear without forcing it. I didn't need it right now. I was only drawn to it for a moment. I closed the app without buying anything, and surprisingly, I felt lighter. It didn't feel like losing something. Holding back didn't feel as hard as I imagined. Sometimes it even felt relieving, because I was finally choosing with awareness. A week later, I opened the budget again. The numbers feel quieter this time. Nothing dramatic, just more aligned than before. I notice we are not living more narrowly. We still enjoy small things as we always did. The difference is simply awareness. Armin begins to follow the pause rule too. Before ordering coffee, he pauses for a moment. I can see the shift without him saying anything. We start reminding each other gently, not to control, but to stay on the same path. It feels more like teamwork now. Myra is still happy as always. The house feels just as warm. Nothing feels missing. I begin to notice something clearly. Many things I thought I needed were not really important. The urgency fades when I pause. Budgeting feels different now. It is no longer about limiting life. It quietly guides our decisions instead. And I realize something small but important. That direction is built from tiny pauses. Not big changes, just quiet moments. I used to think the problem was not having enough. But when I look closer, it often starts with small decisions made too quickly, the kind that feel harmless in the moment. Money rarely disappears all at once. It slips away quietly through things that feel routine, almost invisible when you're inside it. A small pause can change more than I expected. It gives me a moment to notice what I'm about to do, and that moment quietly shifts my choice. I'm still learning how to do this. Some days I get it right, other days I don't. And sometimes I still give in without thinking. Maybe this is just how it goes. Learning slowly, step by step, to take better care of a home and everything inside it. And finding peace in doing it with awareness.